Thank you. And thank you to the Southwest Conference on Asian Studies for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Since time immemorial, Okinawa was an independent nation known as Luchu. Although Japanese and Westerners commonly say Ryukyu today, Luchu is the native pronunciation. I am native Luchuan, and it's also historically the most common pronunciation, so that is what I will be using in this presentation. According to archaeologists, Luchuans have lived in the Luchu Islands for at least 32,000 years. Luchuans are recognized by the United Nations as an indigenous people group with their own unique history, culture, languages, values, and identity. A lot of foreigners, including Japanese, are under the mistaken belief that Luchuans are the minority population in Luchu today, but this is not even close to being true. Luchuans are easily the majority population of Luchu, numbering around 1.4 million living in the Luchu Islands, and another 700,000 or so living overseas. Geographically, Luchu is situated conveniently between China, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, and the Pacific, and has long had close trade relations and cross-cultural exchange with all of these regions. Today, a lot of Westerners and Japanese again have a mistaken belief that Okinawa and all of the Luchu Islands are geographically close to Japan, but actually they're not that close. In fact, Manila, Pyongyang, Seoul, and many major Chinese cities are geographically closer to Naha, the largest city of the Luchu Islands, than Tokyo is. China and Luchu have always had a particularly special and important relationship, and this will be the focus of my presentation today. According to the historic Chinese records, Emperor Qin Shi Huang sent out an expedition in search of the legendary elixir of immortality to what he referred to as the happy immortals living in the Eastern Islands. This is now believed to be a reference to Luchu. The expedition never returned to China, and it is unclear what happened to them, but it is believed they arrived not in Luchu, but in Japan to the north, where they lived out the remainder of their lives. The earliest known written mention of the name Luchu comes from the Book of Sui, published in the year 636 CE during the Tang Dynasty, though in this case the Chinese characters are slightly different from the characters we use today. The Sui sent a party to Luchu, though evidence suggests they actually arrived in the Japanese island of Yaku or Yakushima, which is just south of Kyushu. During the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols under Kublai Khan twice tried to subjugate Luchu, first in the year 1272 and again in 1276, though Luchuans successfully expelled them. For this reason, Luchuans have never really considered the Yuan to be a true Chinese dynasty, but rather consider it an era in which China was under foreign rule, which would be very different from how the later Qing dynasty under Manchu rule would be perceived, because the Manchu more faithfully adapted to Chinese customs, which Luchuans were familiar with. The founding of the Ming Dynasty in 1368 proved to be a significant turning point in China-Luchu relations, which up until this time had been limited to informal trade and cross-cultural exchange. In the year 1372, the Ming court sent a delegation to Luchu and invited them to send representatives to the Ming capital of Nanjing, which Luchu did, and they formally requested to become a tribute state of China. Luchu became China's first formal sovereign tribute state, followed shortly after by Korea and much of Southeast Asia. It was only Luchu and Korea, however, that would remain consistent in maintaining the relationship until the late 19th century, when Japan invaded both countries and later even invaded China itself. Today, a lot of Westerners as well as Japanese people have a difficult time understanding the China-Luchu tributary relationship because it is vastly different from the Western colonial concept of vassal or tribute state. The relationship would perhaps more accurately be termed a sovereign tributary relationship because under this arrangement, Luchu maintained its sovereignty and in fact had its sovereignty guaranteed and protected by China. A lot of Americans and Japanese like to talk about the China-Luchu relationship as if China had subjugated and oppressed Luchu, similar to how the United States and Japan has done within the last century. But we can see from the overwhelming amount of historical evidence that this was far from the truth. It was actually Luchu who was the driving force in maintaining this relationship. The China-Luchu relationship was consensual and mutually beneficial. It can be described as like father and son, or like older brother and younger brother. It is important to point out that China never once violated Luchu's rights or sovereignty in any way. The China-Luchu tributary missions were very well documented in the official government records from both sides, spanning the courses of the Ming and the Qing dynasties. There were two basic trade aspects to this relationship, one being the formal presentation of tribute products to China. But even this was not a one-sided relationship, because Luchuans would present many gifts to China, and in return, China would present many gifts to Luchu. China always gave more to Luchu than what they received in order to demonstrate their vast wealth and generosity. Luchuans were extremely happy with this arrangement and sought to pay tribute to China as often as possible. Luchu paid tribute to China more frequently than any other nation. At one point, China's treasuries were actually being drained, causing China to politely request that Luchu and the other tribute states pay tribute less often. However, this request was not enforced, and Luchu managed to convince China to continue allowing them to pay their regular tribute every 2 years. The second profitable aspect of this relationship occurred in the form of the informal trade that happened alongside the formal procession. As a tribute state of China, Luchu gained access to China's huge network of trade partners. Luchu would trade its own domestic products such as lacquerware, agriculture, ocean products, sulfur, horses, and textiles to other nations in exchange for luxury items. They would then retrade some of those items to different nations at enormous profits, often hundreds of times more than what they paid. But these other nations were usually happy to pay this exorbitant price because it was difficult, if not impossible, for them to obtain these items any other way. This China-Luchu relationship was important for both sides, not only due to the trade it provided, but also for political and diplomatic reasons. The most important part of this relationship for China was the prestige it received by having Luchu as a sovereign tribute state. Having Luchu pay tribute to it was important, not in spite of the fact that Luchu maintained its sovereignty, but because it maintained its sovereignty. For a respected foreign nation like Luchu to willingly, freely, and eagerly acknowledge that China was the greatest nation in the world was a huge sign of respect for China, and an indication that the rulers of China were doing a good job. This helped to legitimize China's rulers, which in turn provided stability, both domestically and in China's foreign affairs. Whenever a new Chinese emperor took the throne, it was expected that Luchu and all of China's sovereign tribute states would send an ambassador to formally recognize and congratulate the new ruler. If Luchu and the other sovereign tribute states refused to do so, it was not only an embarrassment, but it could indicate that the ruler was not truly legitimate and perhaps lacked the mandate of heaven. We can see that this was played out during the transition between the Ming and the Qing. The Qing dynasty was established in the year 1636 and captured the Ming capital of Beijing in 1644, though Luchu did not recognize the Qing until the year 1654, when they could finally be assured that the Qing were the new legitimate rulers of China, and that their old friends, the Ming, who had treated them so well for hundreds of years, had now lost the mandate of heaven. During the mid-19th century, Japan began its process of industrialization. They created a modern Western-style military and desired to collect colonies similar to the way Western nations had been doing. In 1872, Japan began the process of forcefully annexing Luchu against the will of Luchuans. So Luchu attempted to defend themselves by requesting China's help. China at the time, however, was experiencing many problems of its own, both domestically and internationally. China attempted to negotiate a deal that would preserve Luchu's independence, but China was simply too weak at the time. The negotiations failed, and in 1879, Japan had completed its forced annexation of Luchu. Some Luchuan leaders fled in exile to China. During the First Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1894, Luchuans hoped and prayed for a Chinese victory, which would also mean the restoration of Luchu's independence. China, of course, lost, and at this point, Luchuans realized that China was simply too weak to help Luchu, and that they would have to find other ways of surviving under Japanese occupation. Nevertheless, Luchuans continued to hope and pray for the day that China would once again become strong enough to help Luchu break free from Japanese occupation and restore its independence. Luchu would remain under Japanese occupation until 1945, when it came under control of the U.S. military. After World War II, all of Japan's other colonies were given back their independence except for Luchu, which the U.S. decided to keep for itself to use for military bases. Luchuans are well known for opposing the military, so in 1972, the U.S. gave Luchu to Japan without a vote from Luchuans, and since then, Luchu has been under joint Japanese and U.S. occupation. This is why a lot of Americans and Japanese tend to ignore or downplay the long history of close, friendly relations between China and Luchu, because it makes the US and Japan both look very bad in comparison. The United States and Japan often use the so-called threat of China in an attempt to justify the ongoing military occupation of Luchu. Again, though, the facts do not support this claim. The People's Republic of China has always officially recognized that Luchu was an independent country prior to Japan's forced annexation in 1879, and they have always supported Luchu's right to self-determination. Even to this day, the overwhelming majority of Luchuans do not consider China to be a threat, as evidenced by the fact that around 80 to 90% of the Luchu population is demanding a significant reduction or a complete removal of all American and Japanese military forces from the Luchu Islands. If China were really a threat, Luchuans would be begging the US and Japanese military to stay, not calling for their removal on a daily basis. It should be pointed out that the only countries ever to invade and occupy Luchu are Japan and the United States. Now, what about the issue of the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands? The small uninhabited islands in the East China Sea in between China and Luchu. Western and Japanese media and government officials love to criticize China's claim over these islands, but actually the historical evidence strongly indicates that the islands do rightfully belong to China. Luchu has never claimed the Diaoyu Islands. The Luchuan, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the European historical records all indicate that these islands have always been considered Chinese territory prior to the start of Japanese imperialism during the late 19th century. Luchu was historically an international center of trade, finance, diplomacy, and cross-cultural exchange, and often mediated between various nations, including between China and other nations. A neutral, demilitarized, and independent Luchu in the 21st century could once again assume that role, leading to greater peace, stability, and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region.
This concludes my presentation today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm Robert Kajiwara. I'll see you next time.